Hi, Nick Dogan, North State Law. We safeguard your professional license so you can get back to business. Today, we're going to talk about the dangers of entering into a voluntary surrender of your professional license with a state board or state agency. And that's typically done through a consent order. Consent order is something I took a deep dive on in a different video. So I'll have that available at the end of this video. So feel free to check that out. Just a little bit about what a consent order is. Basically, it is a legal document that resolves a complaint against a licensee via specific findings of fact and conclusions of law, and results in typically a penalty. Now, there's exceptions to that, but that's what that other video talks about. I'm going to stay in my lane on this video and talk about the voluntary surrenders and the dangers therein. So, the two agencies that I've seen this the most prevalent with is the Department of Insurance in North Carolina and the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. Most of the time, and there's always exceptions to everything, but most of the time when I've seen the Department of Insurance propose a voluntary surrender, it's usually when there is some sort of serious allegation of fraud. I can't remember off the top of my head if I've seen them do it for something that wasn't pretty egregious. But even then, you really do still need to be careful because with fraud allegations from the Department of Insurance, they are likely to investigate those on a criminal level as well. So you really have to be careful when you're talking about any sort of fraud and any sort of criminal investigation as well, because what you put down in a consent order or any sort of writing that has your signature on it can be used in a criminal matter against you. So you really, really, really need to be wary of what you're reading, what you're signing, because there are going to be not only ramifications with your licensing entity, but potentially ramifications at the criminal level. So the other agency that I've seen propose voluntary surrenders, probably the second most behind the Department of Insurance, is, like I mentioned, the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. I've seen them do it, not a bunch, but I've seen them do it. But I've also seen them do it on a couple occasions for things that I would not consider very egregious, and a couple times where I felt like the client had, or a person that came to me later after it was signed had a little bit more of an argument than they might have initially thought. Um, Also, sometimes it's not very clear in these consent orders what voluntary surrender means. And with these two agencies, their position is it's a permanent voluntary surrender. So, permanent meaning you're done. You cannot get a license in this state practicing in that profession again. I will say that I've seen stuff with more of with the real estate commission where their orders are not always written the best, and it can be very, very, very confusing as far as if you can apply for a new license or not. And that's another thing that I think the layperson might not fully understand. Like when they say permanent surrender of your license, okay, I think most people would take that as, all right, I'm giving up this license. That doesn't necessarily mean I can't turn around and apply for a new license with a new license number. Well, from some of these agencies' perspectives and some of these boards' perspectives, the way that they write some of their consent orders, like I said, might not be very good. And in their mind, oh, well, we meant permanent as you can never apply again. But then they'll let you apply again to get a new license, but then they'll say, nah, we're going to deny you for the license because, as we said, it was a permanent surrender. Which then begs the question, well, if it's a permanent surrender, why did you even let me apply in the first place? Why did you take my money and let me apply? So I do think that while I understand their perspective and I understand what the definition of permanent means, I also understand the perspective of, people that especially are pro se, they're just trying to get something that they view as a a pain in their side out of the way because they're not thinking long term that they might be a different person in 10 or 15 or 20 years or whatever the case may be, and that maybe they do want to get it back into that particular profession, but they got to have a license to do it. And maybe they kind of jumped the gun a little bit. Or maybe they read over everything and it wasn't made clear to them that, hey, permanent meant can't ever practice that profession again in this state because you're required to have a license and we're not going to give you one. So you really have to go through any legal document with a fine-tooth comb, especially anything that you're going to be signing. Absolutely. But you definitely need to go through a voluntary surrender consent order and pick apart what they really mean by permanent. I mean, if it's undefined or the voluntary surrender is just, hey, you specifically says you can reapply within 3, 4, 5 years, then it's very clear that you can reapply in 3, 4, 5 years. If there's no language like that, your argument becomes more difficult. The other thing to take into consideration is, and it really depends on the board or agency, but when they do a revocation, typically the revocation is 5 years. So some of them won't do a revocation per se, or they'll claim they won't do a revocation per se. Board of Nursing, for example, they say, well, we don't do a revocation. We'll just suspend the license and you can reapply after the determined time frame. Okay, fair. They're clear. They're concise. They lay it out pretty plainly for everybody. Other ones, typically per statute will have in their revocation means, can't practice in this profession, can't have a license for 5 years. So my question always is to people that want to agree with a voluntary surrender is, do you never ever want to do this again? And if so, why do you want to remove that as an option? Also, there's always a possibility that, all right, you don't want to have a hearing, you don't want to go through the process, but you also want to keep it as an option that you can practice in that profession again and get a license. Okay. You can always go through the process all the way up to a hearing and then either participate in the hearing, and if the hearing doesn't go your way and they want to revoke it, they revoke it. And then they have to set a time frame of when, and usually it's by statute or their own administrative code. But let's just say, taking 5 years as an example, because that's the most common one. Let's say they revoke it for 5 years. Okay, you got a set time frame there. It's not permanent at that point. Is it going to be easy to get your license back when you reapply after the 5 years? Probably not, but at least you have it as an option. And you don't have to, you can wait 10 years, you can wait 8 years. You don't have to apply, 5 years and 1 day later. So it really honestly doesn't make a ton of sense to enter into a voluntary surrender of your license, especially one that has the word permanent anywhere on a consent order, because as you get older, your situation's going to change and you may say, you know what, I really miss selling insurance. I was great at it. And I got these opportunities that have arisen now because people that I used to work with a while back, they reached back out to me, or I reconnected with somebody, or you just got some weird, happenstance where you run into somebody. Hey, you still doing this? No, I hadn't done that. Man, you were great at doing that. You should consider doing that again. Well, if you've already done a permanent voluntary surrender, from the board's perspective or the agency's perspective, they're not going to issue you a license, or they're not going to want to issue you a license. And then it becomes very difficult for you to get the opportunity to get that license, or get a new license, I should say, in that chosen profession. So life a lot of times is all about options. Keeping your option open is a huge thing, especially when it comes to doing things for a living. There is a constitutional right to do what you love, and a right to have a job and do a job. And with that comes certain constitutional protections like a hearing. So that's always going to be an option for you. You definitely want to explore all options. You don't want to jump into, all right, just take my license, because you might never get the option of getting a license from that licensing entity again. I've seen that pop up, I don't know how many times, where people will call our office and say, hey, I I did this voluntary surrender. I didn't realize it was permanent. And then there's some undoing, and there's some things that you can potentially do, but it's difficult. Whereas if somebody said, you know what, this might be difficult on the front end, I'm gonna go through the process. If they revoke me, they revoke me. It's not gonna be permanent. It's gonna be XYZ timeframe, whatever's in their codes or statutes. But after that time frame's done, assuming that I lose at a hearing, I can come back and I can apply for a new license. So always want to keep your options open, but most importantly, you always want to read anything that you are going to sign, especially when it comes to your professional license. You have to read. If you got any questions on anything, you can always feel free to reach out to my office, 919-521-8810. You can text or call that number. You can get a free 15-minute discovery call with a member of my staff. I hope everybody has a fantastic day. Please keep taking care of North Carolina. Bye-bye.